Make ready, men! Make ready, for the storm is here! Our foes assail us, but we can weather their worst, and we can triumph! We will not be beaten down or pushed aside, but we will stand firm, as our ancestors did.
This is the worst part. Fighting is easy after this.
Are they ours?
The sun rose high in the sky, casting a golden glow on the unfortified village that lay at the periphery of Maurya territory. Prince Vitashoka had chosen this location to defend against the invading Parthian army, which had been marching towards the Maurya border for weeks. The Parthian Empire was advancing, and the village was the last line of defense before they could march on the provincial Maurya capital Taxila. The sound of thundering hooves echoed through the village as the Parthian army approached. The Maurya army, led by Prince Vitashoka, had taken position in the center of the village, waiting for the enemy to arrive. They had no walls or fortifications to protect them, but they had faith in their soldiers and their weapons. They were defending their land, their people, and their honor. They had to be brave, and they had to be smart. They knew that they were outnumbered, but they had resolved to fight until the bitter end. The Maurya army was composed of spearmen, archers, an elite cavalry bodyguard, some elephants, and two-handed sword-wielding shock infantry. The core of the Maurya army, the spearmen, were equipped with long spears and shields. They wore medium armor made of leather or metal scales. Their shields were made of wood or hide. These shields were used to deflect arrows and other projectiles. The archers were equipped with longbows and wore light armor. The elite cavalry bodyguard served as the personal guard of the Maurya prince. They were heavily armored and rode powerful horses. They carried swords and lances and were trained in both shock and ranged combat. The shock infantry were the heavy hitters of the army, armed with two-handed swords and small shields. The elephants were the most fearsome part of the Maurya army. The Maurya army utilized elephants as both a symbol of power and a weapon of war. The elephants were heavily armored and carried wooden towers on their backs, from which archers could rain down arrows on enemy forces. The elephants were also used as battering rams to break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the Parthian army was composed of heavy and light cavalry archers, light infantry, medium spearmen, and very heavy elite shock cavalry. The heavy cavalry archers wore a full suit of armor and carried a composite bow and arrows. The light cavalry archers wore a lighter suit of armor and carried a shorter bow and arrows. Both types of cavalry were used to harass the enemy and disrupt their formations. The Parthian army also had a few units of light infantry. These soldiers were lightly armored and carried a short sword or spear. They were used to support the cavalry and harass the enemy. The medium spearmen were the main infantry unit in the Parthian army. They wore simple linothorax and carried a spear and shield. They wore medium armor and relied on their shields for protection. The elite shock cavalry was heavily armored and rode powerful horses. They were armed with lances and swords and were used to charge into enemy lines and break them apart. Vitashoka took up his position at the front of the Maurya army, his bodyguards flanking him on either side. The Parthians came thundering towards them, their horses kicking up dust and dirt as they galloped forward. The Maurya general, Vitashoka, surveyed the battlefield from atop his horse. He knew that his soldiers would have to use their wits to defeat the Parthian horse archers, who could shoot from a distance and retreat quickly. Vitashoka devised a plan to lure the Parthians into a trap. As the battle began, the Parthian horse archers rode forward, shooting arrows that rained down upon like a deadly storm at the Maurya infantry. The Maurya held their shields and stood their ground. They waited for the Parthians to come closer. The Parthians were known for their horse archery, and they were confident they could pick off the Maurya soldiers from a distance. The Maurya archers let loose a barrage of arrows, but the Parthian cavalry was too quick, and most of the arrows missed their mark. But the Maurya warriors were cunning. As the Parthians continued to rain down arrows on the Maurya infantry, the general gave the signal. The Maurya warriors parted, revealing a clear path straight through the center of their ranks. The Parthians, sensing an opportunity, charged forward, eager to exploit the opening. As they galloped full speed ahead, they suddenly found themselves impaled on the sharp wooden stakes, which had been concealed beneath the ground. The Maurya had lured the Parthians into a trap, and now they were paying the price. The Parthian horse archers, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, tried to regroup and change tactics, but it was too late. The Maurya infantry, now emboldened by their success, charged forward and began to engage the Parthians in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Elite Parthian cataphracts were enraged after seeing their brother-in-arms in danger. Then Parthians' heavy cavalry charged towards the Maurya spearmen, their horses galloping at full speed. The Maurya archers shot arrows at them, but the Parthians were too fast and agile. Their armor is too strong for archers. The Maurya spearmen stood their ground, waiting for the enemy to come closer. As the Parthian cavalry closed in, the Maurya spearmen moved forward, their long spears at the ready. The Parthian cavalry had expected the Maurya to flee in terror, but instead, they stood firm, their spears thrusting forward to meet the charging horsemen. The first wave of cataphracts crashed into the Maurya shield wall, their horses rearing up as they collided with the sturdy shields. The spearmen stood firm, bracing themselves against the impact. The Parthians were taken by surprise seeing the sheer determination of Maurya. The Parthian soldiers were heavily armored, but the Maurya spearmen were well trained and agile. They dodged the heavy swings of the Parthian swords and struck back with their own weapons. As the Parthians regrouped for another charge, the Maurya began to hurl their spears, aiming for the gaps in the cataphracts' armor. Some of the spears found their mark, piercing through the chinks in the armor and striking the riders beneath. The cataphracts, however, were undeterred, and charged forward once again. This time, the Maurya had a surprise in store for the Parthians. Prince Vitashoka had ordered his archers to take up position behind the spearmen, and they now let loose a volley of arrows at the cataphract as they charged towards the Maurya shield wall. The arrows rained down on the Parthians, striking their horses and causing them to rear up in pain. The Maurya took advantage of the chaos to strike back with their spears. The spearmen thrust their spears at the vulnerable spots in the cataphract's armor, while others used their shields to bash the riders off their horses. The Parthians, taken aback by the ferocity of the Maurya, began to waver. Sensing their moment, Vitashoka ordered his troops to advance, and the spearmen pushed forward, their shields slamming into the Parthians. The cataphracts, now disoriented and panicked, began to retreat, their riders desperately trying to regain control of their horses. The Parthian horses were strong and fast, but they were no match for the Maurya spearmen in prolonged melee. The horses fell to the ground, and the Parthian soldiers were thrown off their saddles. The Maurya spearmen finished them off with their swords and spears. The Maurya archers let fly with their arrows, their aim was true, taking out more of the Parthian cavalry. The Parthians tried to regroup, but the Maurya spearmen held their ground, forcing the Parthians to engage in fierce melee. Parthian infantry which was held in reserve and now thrown into battle to stabilize the front line. While the Parthian infantry moved forward towards front line, At the same time the Maurya shock infantry charged into battlefield, their swords glinting in the sunlight. As the two forces moved closer to each other, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The Maurya shock infantry let out a deafening war cry as they charged towards the Parthian lines. The Parthian spearmen formed a tight formation, their spears held aloft in anticipation of the onslaught. The light infantry moved to flank the Maurya army, attempting to get behind their lines and attack from the rear. The Maurya shock infantry charged forward with reckless abandon, their swords slicing through the air as they cut down the Parthian spearmen with ease. The Parthian soldiers tried to hold their ground, but the sheer force of the Maurya charge was too much for them to handle. The Maurya shock troops tore through the Parthian lines, their swords carving a bloody path through the enemy ranks. But the Parthians were not to be underestimated. Though Maurya shock infantry hacked their way through the Parthian spearmen, cutting through their ranks with brutal efficiency, but the Parthians were not so easily defeated. Their superior numbers allowed them to surround the Maurya soldiers, attacking them from all sides. Parthian infantry encircled the Maurya shock infantry, their light infantry attacking from behind and the spearmen closing in from the front. The Maurya fought valiantly, but the sheer weight of the Parthian numbers began to take its toll. One by one, the Maurya shock troops fell to the ground, their bodies pierced by Parthian spears. The battle quickly devolved into a bloody melee, with soldiers on both sides fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground. The Maurya cavalry charged in to provide support, but they were met with a hail of arrows from the Parthian archers. Prince Vitasoka saw that his army was in trouble. He rallied his troops and urged them to fight on, even as they were outnumbered and outmatched. The Maurya infantry fought with renewed vigor, their swords flashing in the sun as they cut down the Parthian soldiers. But the Parthian army was relentless. They refused to back down, even as their soldiers fell around them. Parthian general Cinemus himself led his bodyguard charged against the Maurya infantry. The two armies clashed once again, with neither side gaining the upper hand. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, the Maurya army was in a precarious position. They had lost many soldiers, and their morale was starting to falter. But Prince Vitasoka refused to give up. Encouraged by the determination of their commander, the Maurya soldiers fought with everything they had left, their swords flashing once again in the fading light. The Maurya soldiers fought with a desperate determination, knowing that the fate of their empire hung in the balance. They pushed forward relentlessly, their swords hacking and slashing at the Parthian spearmen. They pushed the Parthian soldiers back, gaining ground inch by inch. The Maurya fought with such a ferocity that stunned the Parthians. Despite their superior tactics and mobility, the Parthians were gradually being worn down by the Maurya shock infantry. The two-handed swords wielded by the Maurya soldiers were devastating weapons, capable of cleaving through armor and bone with ease. Finally, with a roar of triumph, they broke through the Parthian lines. Sensing the opportunity, the Maurya cavalry charged into the fray once again, their horses galloping at full speed this time toward unprotected Parthian archers. The horses pounding across the ground with a thunderous force, the ground shook as they closed in on the Parthians. The Parthian archers stood their ground, drawing their bows and releasing a volley of arrows. The arrows whistled through the air, their deadly tips glinting in the sunlight. The Maurya soldiers were well trained and well armored, their shields deflecting the majority of the arrows that rained down upon them. But a few managed to find their mark, and screams of agony filled the air as horses and riders alike were struck down by the deadly missiles. As the Maurya cavalry drew closer, they slashing their swords, the edges gleaming in the sunlight. The Parthian archers quickly dropped their bows and drew their swords, ready to meet the charging cavalry head-on. The two sides collided, the clash of metal ringing out across the battlefield. The Maurya fought with ferocity, their swords slashing violently, seeking to decapitate their enemies. The Parthians, meanwhile, relied on their agility and maneuverability, using their swords to strike at the Maurya vulnerable flanks. The Parthian archers fought back with equal ferocity, their swords flashing through the air as they parried and struck at their opponents. But the Maurya cavalry were well trained in close combat, and they slowly began to gain the upper hand. The fighting was intense and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, their blood staining the grassy plains a deep crimson. Despite the heavy losses, the Maurya cavalry pressed on, their determination unwavering. They fought with a fierce intensity, driving the Parthian soldiers back with every blow. Despite being outnumbered, the Maurya soldiers fought with incredible bravery and courage. The Maurya fought with all their might, their bravery and determination unwavering. They pushed forward, driving the Parthians back with their sheer force of will. But the Parthians refused to be defeated. They fought back with equal ferocity, their courage and valor shining through. As the battle raged on, the sound of clanging swords and screaming soldiers filled the air. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, both Maurya and Parthian. The sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The battle was bloody, and both sides suffered heavy losses. The battle was chaotic, with soldiers fighting hand to hand in the narrow streets of the village. The Maurya soldiers fought with bravery and courage, determined to protect their homeland from the invading Parthians. The Parthian soldiers fought with equal courage, determined to conquer the Maurya Empire. The sun was setting, and the two armies were still locked in combat. Both sides were exhausted, but their determination did not waver. But the battle was not over yet. At this pivotal moment of the battle, Prince Vitasoka finally revealed his ace card, his war elephants. The massive beasts charged forward, shaking the ground with their massive strides, their trunks trumpeting and their tusks gleaming in the sun. The Parthian archers unleashed a barrage of arrows, but the thick hides of the elephants protected them from harm. The Parthian army tried to retreat, but the elephants were too fast, too strong, and too unstoppable. They smashed through the Parthian lines, trampling soldiers beneath their feet, and tossing them into the air like rag dolls. The Parthian commander Cinemus quickly realized the danger he was in. He ordered his soldiers to fall back, regroup, and try to form a new line. But it was too late. The Maurya elephants had already broken through, and their riders were hacking and slashing at the enemy with swords and spears. The Parthian soldiers fought bravely, but they were no match for the Maurya. The elephants rampaged through their ranks, trampling anyone who got in their way. The Maurya infantry followed close behind, cutting down anyone who tried to flee. The Parthian soldiers were now surrounded on all sides, with no way to escape. In a desperate last stand, the Parthians fought back with all their might. But it was no use. The Maurya had the upper hand this time, and their elephants were unstoppable. The Parthians were routed, their army broken, and their dreams of conquest shattered. In the end, the Parthian army was defeated, their soldiers lying dead or dying in the streets of the village. The Parthians were forced to retreat, their once mighty army shattered and broken. The Maurya emerged victorious, their war elephant standing proud amidst the rubble of the battlefield. The battle had been long and bloody, but in the end, it was the Maurya army that emerged triumphant.